there's too many young women having children, and they're not bringing their children up right. So we stuck with a lot of black children who don't have proper education, and they're just kind of going wild on the streets and everything. And everybody's looking and saying, this is our future generation, and we're not taking care of them. And to an extent, that's true, and we have to look to ourselves for it and stop expecting the government to pay for everything, you know, organize our own groups and stuff like that.
I'm G.A. Solo. Hello. The frequency of negative outcomes from the sexual relations among people has its correlations with education, social class, income, and culture, not race. People who are less educated about sex, people with less financial means, people in lower class neighborhoods, people in a culture where sex is perceived and treated in a certain way, will have higher levels of unplanned pregnancies, circulation of STDs, and even occurrences of rape. These are all problems. In this series, however, we are discussing such problems among black populations, and in this part, I'll mostly discuss the topic in the context of the Republic of South Africa. The numbers are not good. South Africa has the highest number of HIV cases in the world, at 7.8 million people. To put how bad that is into perspective, America has a population of about 331.9 million people, but only had about 1.1 million cases at the end of 2019. South Africa has only around 59.3 million people, but it has 7.8 million people with HIV. About 13,000 Americans die due to AIDS in the US every year, while that number is around 86,000 people in South Africa. There is clearly a problem here. Let's consider this more closely in relation to black people. In America, black Americans far outrank all other races regarding STD infections in the US. This, of course, is also due to history. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male being an example of government experimentation that contributed to the high numbers we see today, whereby they allowed the syphilis disease to go untreated in nearly 400 African American males in order to test its effects on human beings. These men were used as guinea pigs, and they were not even aware of any of this, which means that many of them unknowingly spread the disease to their sexual partners. And as a direct result of the experiment, more than 100 black men died. Of course, this partially contributes to the issue. In 2018, black Americans accounted for 42% of all HIV cases in the United States. And remember that blacks only make up about 13% of the United States population, and they're not even the largest minority in the country. In South Africa, blacks bear 95% of the 7.8 million HIV cases in the country. In the UK, almost half of those with HIV are white, which is no surprise. But what is concerning is that black people, who are only about 4% of the population, made up about 18% of the HIV cases in 2019. What's more, by percentage, the top 10 countries with the highest percentages of HIV are all in sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a problem. And of course, this problem does not affect every black person or every black community in the world, but it is an issue that should not be downplayed or denied. Now, I will not be going into the biology of a possible greater susceptibility of HIV among people of African heritage. I will only mention that there has been a study that found that around 10% of Europeans have a greater resistance to HIV. Speculations as to why this is may be due to having survived a number of devastating plagues over a few centuries. This is of course not unthinkable, as a large percentage of Congolese people, for example, have complete immunity from malaria. This likewise is due to having developed this immunity over many years. But in this part, I am more concerned about the social causes of the problem regarding STDs and unplanned pregnancies, among other problems related to sex. I want to understand why these problems are not going down and what can be done to resolve the issue. 85% of the 155 countries teach sex education. It is absolutely taught in South Africa as well, but it's how seriously people take sex education and how much of it they are willing to apply in their lives that matters. Where sex education is taught, most of us know, or at least hopefully know, the primary factors of sexually transmitted infections. They include unprotected sex, sharing of needles, multiple sexual partners, ignorance of symptoms, poor judgment due to alcohol consumption, rape, and so on. So when one observes the population, despite the people having an understanding of these factors, these remain the causes of STI spread among black people. In South Africa, culture is absolutely the primary reason for this. It is no secret that in South Africa, most children who are born by accident, or at least unintentionally. Between 2015 and 2019, 65% of pregnancies in South Africa were unintended and unplanned. Over 30% are girls between the age of 10 and 15, and 37% resulted in abortion. Those are a lot of problems I've just mentioned, though the most concerning part is regarding the children who are eventually brought to term. The majority of such children will likely grow up with extended family, often their grandparents, in villages or townships. The family in question will usually be that of the mother, because oftentimes the father is never heard from again. And in many cases, the father is not even known, since the mother has multiple sexual partners, and DNA tests are not readily available or affordable for most people in South Africa. But also in many cases, the father is known, but not named by the mother, in order for the mother to obtain financial benefits from the government, which will not be given if the father is known, because then he'll be made to pay for his own child. Some mothers then prefer to cash in on the benefits while they're not even taking care of the child themselves. The child is often with his or her grandparents.
I mean, if you sustain that type of system, you instilling that type of mentality in your child. When she gets up, when she grows up to be 18, she sees what all her friends are doing. You saying, look, when I turn 18, I can give me a check. I get my food stamps. I can get my WIC. Everything's taken care of. Maybe I could find a boyfriend who will help me out,
Now the apple clearly does not fall far from the tree, as most of these children, if not all, end up repeating the mistakes of their parents at one time or another in their lives. This is very unfortunate. But because abortion is much more readily available these days, some manage to avoid having an unplanned child by having abortion after abortion, despite the availability of birth control such as condoms. Other mothers have one abortion, but end up having other unintended pregnancies in the future and do not wish to go through the abortion procedure a second time, and so carry their child or children to term. Statistically speaking, many of these children will end up committing crimes beginning from a very early age, largely due to the absence of their parents. Now, of course, it's not always the case that the guardians who are taking care of them are doing a bad job, but one must take into consideration the age and financial status of both the stand-in guardians and the parents. Many of these mothers tend to be in other provinces or towns, either playing around or pursuing an education, a job, or trying to find a man who could potentially take care of both her and her unplanned child. Ironically, though, the man they may be interested in may have impregnated some other girl somewhere else. Not even Nelson Mandela was exempt from this, as he himself had several extramarital sexual relations in his first marriage with his wife knowing.
Mandela later admitted that Winnie had found another lover during their marriage, and the pair divorced before Mandela became president of South Africa.
It is important to understand how commonplace promiscuity is in South Africa to the point of normalization. Once you understand this context, you will understand what is to follow. Now, how did such a situation become so common and widespread among the black population in South Africa? Well, it's primarily because of the attitude that black South Africans generally hold towards sex and sexual partners. Firstly, one must understand that there are a couple of millions more females than males in the country. Also, African civilizations have historically, and in some cases still do, practice polygamy. After the arrival and conversion of many Africans into Christianity, the practice was mostly dropped by many on an official level, but not quite in practice. By the way, it is odd that Christianity would discourage polygamy when there's no scripture that actually prohibits it, and it was perfectly permitted and common in the Old Testament. But anyway, the commonality of both men and women having multiple sexual partners and engaging in intercourse with multiple people in rather short spaces of time is rampant in black communities in South Africa, without being stigmatized, discouraged, punished, or avoided as much as other populations. In some townships, parents and older people will refer to the promiscuity of many girls as them simply being clever. It's another way of saying naughty or mischievous. But as you can quite clearly imagine, this does nothing but encourage the person, since calling someone clever sounds like a good thing or a compliment. It's like being praised for being crafty or tricky. White populations definitely engage in sexual relations with multiple partners as well in the country, and infidelity between couples happens just like anywhere else. However, such acts tend to be stigmatized a bit more, and the perpetrators ostracized a bit more by their family and community for it. This is to the point that the perpetrators will try to conceal it from as many people as possible, but clearly getting caught very often, as white South Africans divorce at a much higher rate than black South Africans, much of it due to infidelity. In black communities, it is also very common for a couple to remain in a relationship despite one or both of them knowing of the other's infidelity, and sometimes even knowing and engaging with the third party. In my experience, I have found that when asking a girl about how she feels about infidelity and multiple sexual partners, which is something I have done very often in university, they often respond with, "He's probably cheating too." Some don't even bother having a justification. One girl simply explained that she enjoyed benefiting from obtaining favors and gifts from her two boyfriends. That particular case was a bit heavy because usually people have what they call a main squeeze and a side person. But in her case, both of her sexual partners were 100% under the impression that they were the only partner in her life. She also proudly stated that she enjoyed the adrenaline of being able to keep this up and felt a bit of security in the event that she should choose to dump one or the other. It would also affect her less if she should find out that one of her partners was cheating, as this would make her feel justified in her own infidelity. The guys I speak with, on the other hand, hardly even consider any of this to be a conversation worth having. In fact, if they do have a girlfriend, they sometimes hide the fact when talking to a woman until it becomes convenient or beneficial for them to mention it. The more concerning part of it is that it's sometimes borderline considered a good thing for a man to have what people call experience with multiple women. And the greater his body count, so to speak, the more attractive or sexually appealing he will be to other women. This, of course, is a clear double standard between the two sexes, as women are considered filthy the higher her body count is. And she'll likely find it more and more easy to have sex with men as her body count increases, but will find it more and more difficult to find a man who would be willing to have a long-term relationship with her. The interesting thing is that this double standard against women is also accepted and used by women. In many of these cases, therefore, it is not so much the issue for the woman that the man cheated, but with whom the man cheated. Because for many women, a man's attractiveness is in part determined by how attractive he is to other women. As when choosing a partner, they may find more safety or security in going for what other women have previously experienced. Of course, with more awareness of this trend being propagated, it seems that more and more women tend to see through this phenomenon, but it will likely never completely disappear. Now, of course, it's not like black South Africans do not at all find it shameful or bad for a person, male or female, to cheat on their partner or have a very casual sex life. But because it is firstly so common and normal, people tend to try to find ways to justify it, downplay it, or simply ignore it. One justification, for example, especially among women, is an assumption that her male partner was likely not treating her well, or satisfying her well enough, or committed enough, usually followed with the assumption that the man was likely cheating as well. The unfortunate and sad reality is this: sometimes it is seen as a bit cringe by other black people when someone is in love. This is because people are so afraid of heavily investing their emotions into a relationship because of the high risks of the relationship failing due to abuse, lack of commitment, infidelity, finances, or whatever. And so people approach their relationships with little energy and low emotion in order to not end up humiliated and heartbroken if things go south. This, of course, is literally a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the act of restraining oneself from giving their all into a relationship is often what ultimately causes the failure of the relationship in the first place. And the more relationships they go through, the more they lose faith in relationships as a whole and focus more on gratification in what they can get out of the relationship instead. Therefore, they do not feel so guilty for breaking another person's heart by cheating on them, because to an extent, they do not always expect their partner to be so emotionally involved either. This is especially true if they do not get caught, because then they feel that their partner will not get hurt. One other aspect of this is that most of these relationships are out of wedlock, so some people do not feel that their own relationships are very serious, unlike if they were married. But because such people get so used to this lifestyle, marriage tends to change very little. Such people will remain as unfaithful and promiscuous as before they were married. I mentioned that income plays a role in sexual problems among black communities as well. Nowadays, prostitution takes many arrangements, but the act is more common among those with greater financial need or desire. Sugar daddies, or in South Africa, blessers, as in people who bless, are not a taboo subject. It's often a topic that makes people laugh. It entails grown men exchanging gifts, money, and favors with young girls, sometimes as young as 12 years old, for sex. Now, it may not be very well known, But ephebophilia is a bit of a gray area in African countries, as well as the Middle East, Japan, South America, and other parts of the world. The age of consent is not usually a topic of discussion because most people generally accept that it should circle around the age of 16 or 18. But in general, it depends on the country. Now, these blessers are quite popular with high school girls and varsity girls, as many of them come from low-income backgrounds, and so an extra source of cash is always welcomed for them. And since most of these girls are already sexually active anyway, it only makes sense, in their minds, to have sex if they can also make some money out of it. Now, this is not like an established prostitution ring, which definitely do exist and sometimes involve children, and practically everyone in the country considers that to be bad. Rather, this is a usually secret arrangement between a grown man, often with a wife and kids of his own, and a younger girl willingly accepting to engage with each other. The grown men get their satisfaction from sleeping with attractive young girls, and the girl gets money to usually spend on things she would not otherwise be able to afford. However, it is a practice that occurs between black South Africans, usually in the city, and in that can come the same consequences as any other sexual interactions, such as STI spread or unplanned pregnancies. As, to make things a bit stranger, it's usually the case that both the blesser and the blessee, I suppose, are in formal relationships with other people, despite their arrangement with each other. For many black people in South Africa, and even the United States, their first time having sex is in their teenage years. This of course can have irreversible consequences if things go awry. Very often, many guardians are reluctant to be strict on their children regarding sex because they would feel hypocritical or be accused of hypocrisy by others, since it is likely that they were sexually carefree in their youth. And despite the helpful advice they could give the child, they prefer to be lenient and let the child or teenager learn on their own with little to no intervention or even knowledge of their sexual lives, despite being their guardians. This is understandable when the child is an adult, but this tends to occur long before then as well, and by the time they become adults, they hardly have any adequate amount of awareness on sexual matters, due to a lack of guidance that could have been given to them. Of course, it's never a comfortable discussion for children and parents to have, but in many cases, it could prevent the child from making many mistakes. Now, among teenagers in environments that provide enough education or control measures to avoid unintended pregnancies or STD spread, education is not particularly the issue. Most teens are time after time given sexual education, but the greater influence, that is their background and home environment, will ultimately influence their decisions much more. And so once again, we see that culture and background influence this matter far more than education does. It is interesting, though, that despite the lax and laissez-faire attitude many in black communities have regarding sex, when things go completely wrong for a younger person, people tend to not be very helpful. As a result, when young people feel afraid that they may have contracted something or may be pregnant, they will less likely tell anyone or seek medical advice or care before the problem becomes irreversible. They may therefore be impacted for the rest of their lives due to an issue that could have been resolved if detected early enough by, for example, having a child that they never wanted, whom they may not treat very well, by the way, or have a lifelong disease that they may spread to others because, as you can imagine, it is not very easy explaining to a potential partner or anyone really that one is sexually diseased. Not only is it unattractive, but it brings with it a large number of assumptions, stigmas, prejudice, and disgust against the person. And since some STDs are asymptomatic, they may not feel the need to tell their sexual partners anything, and that is obviously not good. In conclusion to this topic, the perception and attitude people or society or community have regarding sex and sexuality will determine their choices and actions. The problem is that sex can result in unchangeable consequences, and that is why this attitude or perception sometimes needs guidance in what's best for the individual. Even if one has made mistakes that have led to irreversible problems in one's life, it does not mean that their entire life is over, or that they can never experience happiness again. It simply means that it is important to understand what went wrong to prevent it from occurring again. And for those who are not in such a situation, they still have the opportunity to learn from the mistakes of others and make choices that can prevent such misfortunes for themselves. Defending or trying to justify a manner of living that's objectively detrimental or dangerous to one's life will only make the situation worse and worse. In order to resolve this issue, it is important for all individuals to be honest with themselves regarding whether their way of living is any good for them or not. I'm sure that a sexual life that results in no negative consequences is what everyone would wish for themselves, and it is entirely possible. So by being more self-aware and applying more self-control in one's interactions and choices, one may reduce the risks of unfortunate circumstances in one's life and ultimately in one's entire community. I'm G.A. Soda. Goodbye.
As far as the 21st century is concerned, we should be focusing on our children.
It's sad, so sad. It's a sad, sad situation. And it's getting more and more absurd.